Welcome to the AI Value Podcast. Today, my guest is Todd Henley, founder of PaperKite AI, former chief data governance officer at Northwest Bank, and data governance leader at American Electric Power. Welcome.
Thank you very much, Mark. I appreciate it.
Yeah, so we've known each other for quite some time now. So I think it's like 5 or 10 years or something like that. But you have a new venture, PaperKite AI, where you're providing services that are centered around AI governance, which is a natural extension of data governance. And can you tell our audience a little bit about your company mission and what you're trying to accomplish?
Sure. Yeah, I started Paper actually about 10 years ago, and I was doing some small contract work for some former colleagues, and I'm building small data governance programs for small to mid-tier companies, and actually doing some privacy and security awareness programs for like CSR departments that were putting a little bit too much personal and work information together on social media. So, yeah, that was a good process to, help build a little bit of awareness as to what people are actually putting out on the on social media, and to maintain a little bit of safety and security for them. But I did data strategy for a few small companies, and that was actually about the time that I met up with you, Mark, back in I think probably 2016, 2017, building out a data governance program for a global not-for-profit, OCLC. That was a global not-for-profit designed to capture and maintain metadata about the world's information. So that company was putting together a FedRAMP program because it was a supplier of cloud security or cloud services to the federal government, which FedRAMP is a requirement for all of those cloud service providers. Yeah, so I built out the data governance program for OCLC and started their privacy program. Then went to American Electric Power, really because they were in a little bit of trouble with regulators and third-party auditors, not really truly understanding, where the data was coming from, what the quality of the data that was going into their warehouse that they were using for reporting. So what I built for AEP was a little bit more involved than just building a data governance program. It was largely rearranging an entire department to, figure out an actual workflow that works within the way that utilities are budgeted. If anyone's ever worked for a utility, you'll understand that what they try to do is they try to maximize their capital as opposed to their O&M, their operations and maintenance budget. So that way they can go to a public utilities commission and they can say, hey, we spent so much on capital this quarter, this year, so we need to have a little bit of a rate adjustment, which is great. It's the way that all utilities work. But unfortunately, a lot of data work is O&M, not it's not designed to be capitalizable. So I redesigned a process to make data management or data an actual capitalizable activity within the accounting standards. So that was new, that was innovative, but what it really did was it focused on data products much earlier than the concept of data products really became popular. So that was a very early move, 2020, before we really started thinking about data mesh or really started focusing on data products. Now we can capitalize something on the back end because it is an actual product. Took that experience to a banking and finance institution that was in a little bit of trouble with regulators. That seems to be a common theme. And they needed somebody to build a data governance program, in some respects to tick a box, but in other respects to actually be effective, right, as a data governance program. So when I looked at what was missing, you have to do a gap assessment whenever you're building a new program to figure out, just exactly what's your mark, what is it that you're trying to do. I noticed that there was much more missing than just, a data governance program. And, can sense when you're talking to regulators what the next question is going to be. It's like, what about X? What about Y? What about Z? So instead of waiting for those questions questions to be asked, I put together a plan to build an entire information governance program, which included records and information management, which they already had, to one degree, a RIM program. But it was not necessarily cohesive. It was specifically geared toward a small set of information, a small set of records that were being brought in that they really did need to keep, but it didn't include physical records management very well. It didn't cover a lot of different areas. So it didn't cover content management. There was no data protection and privacy to a cohesive degree. Not that no one was paying attention to it. It's just that it was not cohesive. So instead of waiting for regulators to ask, what about, like, here's the plan, here's the plan, here's the plan. And oh, by the way, we've already executed on this, and this. And that builds a lot of goodwill with regulators. And it actually turned out that, a lot of what we were doing helped to provide some speed to value on certain initiatives. Not only were we able to bring things like CECL into which is, your current expected credit loss, which is a calculation saying, this is how much we have in outstanding credit, that we have, or to our customer base, and this is how much that we have actually, that we actually have in reserve. So you have to have a ratio, and you have to understand what that ratio is. And oh, by the way, how much of that is about to go bad, meaning people not repaying or being late on payments. You have to be able to come up with some sort of understanding. And there are multiple models, but it turns out you can use that for a lot of strategic planning for your organization. So we were able to get a lot of value out of that much faster than we would if we didn't have any guardrails around it. After about, I think, 2022, I started putting together an AI governance program because a lot of the regulatory findings were specifically around, are you really governing your models? Are you really governing anything that has advanced statistical sophistication? Are you putting guardrails around those? Are you really managing the process of development to deployment and disposition? So it's like, okay, well, let's put a little bit more of a centralized rigor around that. So I built what I called Advanced Analytics Center of Excellence, which would take in use cases and prioritize them based on potential value to the organization, and then put guardrails around that process, as well as the development and deployment and eventual disposition of any of those models. It really gave us an opportunity to take the structures that I had built for the institution and be able to reuse them. So in October, November of last year, I exited and started PaperKite up again as information governance and AI governance, and they're connected together. So what I provide, as a very long introduction to the conversation, what I provide to small to mid-tier organizations that are in a regulated space are services that are, I will come in, have an understanding of what your organization is trying to do, put together structures for information and AI governance, put in, policies, standards, anything that doesn't currently exist. I will look at, what does exist and try to reuse that, try to reuse those levers. If they had existed at one time but are abandoned, we can revive those, make a little bit of a spin in how they've been executed before, and then realign them to actually building an information and AI governance program. The reason why I throw in information governance at the same time is because what is it that's fueling, your use cases, and how well has that been managed in the past? I offer 3, 6 to 12-month engagements. These are fractional leadership positions within organizations that is designed to kind of like fade away over a period of time. So I will train people in your organization to take over those roles, or I will help you hire. So it's an interesting package, just kind of rolled up and put together in one product, for clients.
Sure. So the focus on foundational elements here. So you have there's this explosion in artificial intelligence and the hype, and it's there's a lot of like people that are subscribing to tools, and they're starting to on their own without
Right.
any guardrails. They're
Right.
starting to consume AI services to augment their their work
Hmm.
product,
Hmm.
right? So there's some risks associated with that,
Absolutely.
right? And this is sort of like what shadow IT was back when SaaS was emerging,
Right.
times 10,
Absolutely.
right? Because there's a lot of useful stuff,
Hmm.
but there's also the risk of the hallucinations, and there's no controls in place for
Hmm.
that,
Hmm.
right? So
Right.
can you speak to the sort of that you have data products
Hmm.
and AI products, right?
Right.
And then there's the use case selection and prioritization, which is, you said, is value based
Yes.
to some degree, but there's also managing risks. So
Hmm.
feasibility risks,
Right.
adoption risks,
Right.
the risk of introducing a vendor that's not going through the vendor management
Right.
process,
Right.
right? So can you unpack that a little bit?
Yeah, that is, as you said, a really interesting problem that's times 10, back from the shadow IT days. And that's one of the problems that we ran into early, and that's really what kind of prompted the building of the Center of Excellence to begin with. So it wasn't really geared only toward AI. It was geared toward anything that had any statistical sophistication. But yeah, that's what actually started the whole process of building the Center of Excellence. We had an individual that wanted to perform a proof of concept with a partner, a vendor partner. So actually, this was not just third party; this was fourth party, and sent a whole collection of completed loan forms to this partner of a partner in Kiev. So sent this to a war zone where we can be fairly certain that the FSB has some taps into that organization. And this was not consulted with the privacy officer, which was myself at the time, which I would have said, hey, there are some controls here that either are missing or need to be, board up a little bit. So we had changed our third-party risk management to process to I worked with our third-party management program manager to figure out how are we going to, readjust this process to take into account, artificial intelligence, not just artificial intelligence, but where that is actually being that data is being sent to and processed, and that changed to where we started looking at what's the percentage of foreign ownership. That in and of itself is not necessarily a problem. It's the controls and attestation of controls that have been added to that organization's data management processes. Can we truly count on the security of that organization? Do they have any attestation engagements that have been in place? Doesn't matter what it is, but you need to be able to affirm through some attestation engagement that they follow certain security controls and have an understanding of the risks that are associated with the data that you're sending them. You can farm out risk, but you cannot farm out accountability. So if we send something to, if my former employer or somebody from my former employer sends information in the clear to an organization in a war zone, and we didn't do any vetting or checked for any attestation engagements, then that would be a little bit of a problem. There are controls that you can add, data loss prevention controls that you can put in place, and in this case, those controls were circumvented. So now that we know that those controls were circumvented, we can add, new controls in place. You can also do things, like looking for potential indicators that there is some, activity going on that is indicative of artificial intelligence, such as employee using N8N to build an agent that, goes through your Exchange account and, perform certain actions. I mean, you can, tell, that someone is doing that. And if you do not want that to happen, or if you do want that to happen, you can add guardrails to the use of, agents. Unfortunately, back then, those tools just, either were nascent, they were just being developed. There are tools that have been, that have been in place, like data loss prevention tools have been around for a long time, but they never, they weren't necessarily developed for understanding whether or not an agent is, hitting, that server for, a specific purpose. It just kind of looks like a normal person, performing that action. But now there are, much greater indicators of an agent performing an action. So there are guardrails that you can put in place now that, we didn't think about or didn't have the technology to do just 2-3 years ago. So the tool space has advanced amazingly just in the past couple of years. If you're looking for, if you're looking to build an AI governance program, at this point, without tools, what I would say is invest, because it's going to be almost impossible to do without investing in some of those tools, like security with an I, SECURITI, has a great solution for looking for indicators of AI activity. They have a great solution for building firewalls for LLM input and output, making sure that people who only have the right ability to look at the output should be looking at the output of that AI solution.
How is this related to AI observability? So there's
Right.
observability of known solutions
Mm-hmm.
that are
Mm-hmm.
sponsored by the organization, and then there's
Right.
observability of shadow
Mm-hmm.
agents that are being consumed or leveraged by employees.
Right. Right. Yeah, I mean it's the same solution, really. I mean it's for using a platform that's like security or model op, or Monitor, or even, the bigger players like Watson X, or even Calibra is bringing this into their platform. There are indicators of, agentic activity on networks. One of the reasons why, and this has been talked about quite a bit, one of the reasons why ServiceNow picked up data.world was, they needed to use something that is a data catalog on the back end, where they can actually start cataloging some of not just the data that is on endpoints, but how that data is actually being used.
Sure. And the velocity of the data.
Absolutely. Yeah. And Metacarta, which is a great tool for looking at data lineage and seeing how data is moving across a network. These tools are great for looking at indicators of activity. So you can see, for, employee X or employee Y actually leveraging an agent, on your network. Now, if they're at home and, they are actually hitting, your Exchange server, to perform actions that, that they built an agent for. It's like, hey, scrape, look for specific contacts, that kind of thing, and you send out emails to these contacts, or set up meetings with these specific contacts. There are indicators. You can build out indicators of network activity that show that it's an agent that's actually performing those actions, because you're using AI to look at the traffic that's going on in your network and see how some of those nodes are actually interacting with each other. And that's another reason why ServiceNow picked up data.world, because their CMDB is, the hub for them. So they're matching what's in the data catalog with the CMDB, and, are using some network scanning tools to figure out what's actually going on. So, and, this is something that Purview does fairly well, looking at network activity, what's the data that's on your network, how is it categorized, how is it classified, how it's being leveraged within specific use cases, having it tied into Azure Fabric or Microsoft Fabric, however they're marketing right now. Having it tied into Fabric, you could see if there are any agents being built or agents that are acting on anything that's, within the fabrics. It's a really interesting time. If you're not leveraging tools to actually build out and operationalize your AI governance program, you're going to be behind the eight ball a little bit.
There was always a challenge with what was called a 0 day event, which is that thing that has never happened before. So you have your
Yeah.
known unknowns, but then the unknown unknowns,
Hmm.
which are problematic. And
Right.
doing something like a reverse diffusion where you can actually identify anything that's other than normal steady state behavior.
Hmm.
So it's important to be able to identify something that deviates from the norm to
Hmm.
alert human
Hmm.
intervention,
Right.
to alert a subject matter expert that there's
Hmm.
something interesting going on
Right.
here.
Yeah, and that's where, partnering with somebody who has, built out these tools is probably, the best, to your best advantage. It's like the number of organizations that were really considering abandoning CrowdStrike after the CrowdStrike debacle was almost a year ago, maybe about a year ago. Were really speaking outside of their band of knowledge, because the thing is about CrowdStrike is that it's not what's going on today, it's what's going on, or yesterday, it's what's going on today and tomorrow. CrowdStrike looks for indicators of compromise, in a much different way than a lot of tools would do. And that's the reason why it was added into the, or a part, or an adjunctive part to the MSG now, which is very, very low level into the operating system. That's the reason why it was added, because there's only so much that you can do on one specific endpoint, and there's only so much that you can do without learning from each individual specific endpoint. So you have to be able to pull that information and learn from it, and adjust to changing conditions. So yeah, if you're not using tools like that, you're not going to stay either at parity or ahead of the security arms race. Let's put it that way.
Right. So it's definitely a balancing act
Hmm.
between risk and reward.
Right.
And you don't want to be labeled as the chief innovation prevention officer,
It's right.
right? So that
Right.
there
Exactly.
has to be vehicles in place
Hmm.
to identify opportunities, going back to data products and AI products,
Right.
and having
Right.
some, sort of a conduit
Right.
for innovation, for
Hmm.
human creativity.
That was really the impetus behind building the Center of Excellence. So when I put together the data governance program for my former employer, and this is how I've advised current clients if they don't already have these structures in place, is don't just build a data governance program. Don't just build a data governance council. Don't just build a data governance steering committee. Use either what's already in place, or build something that's for data or information, right? Just something that is a little bit more broad. And that's one of the reasons why I look for clients and taking clients that are for small and mid-tier organizations, because one of the great things about that is that when you're building governance structures, you don't want to build, well, this one is for RIM, this one's for content, this one's for data protection and privacy. No, I mean, you are not going to find enough people to staff that, and you're not going to find enough people who are interested in going to this meeting, this meeting, this meeting, this meeting. No, I set up a centralized governance program. It was an information governance program that had one steering committee. I integrated it into a steering committee slash council, whatever you wanted to call it. It was at the strategic level. So anybody that can actually make and execute decisions that would have an impact on either the information that's feeding a data product, or the people who are having an impact on those products and that product development chain. So this way we only had one, but we did have working groups that were at a more tactical level that can really get down into the weeds and advise at the strategic level much better, right? So we took our cue from the executive layer saying, this is what's really important. This is what we really want you to focus on. At the strategic layer, they would say, okay, I get that. I understand that. Here are the things from my part of the organization that are really important to that overall directive from the executive layer. And at the tactical layer, they would say, okay, well, here are the things that you really need to think about or need to worry about, and these are the things that need to change, right? So taking that, I built the Advanced Analytics Center of Excellence, and this is how I advise clients now, because the Center of Excellence is great for feasibility analysis, right? So you take in, use cases that are all over the map, and that's great. That's wonderful. People are actually thinking, this is how, we think that, or this is the challenge that I'm having, and this is a challenge to the organization or for the organization, specifically for these reasons. And we look for alignment between those use cases and what the strategic goals and objectives of the organization are. And the ones that have a closer match, those are the ones that are prioritized. I don't recommend specifically a return on investment as the actual business case. First we look at the use case, then we do a business case analysis and figure out, is this something that we should actually do? But we do, look at things like adoption risks and feasibility risks. And feasibility risks, I generally look at it from a pestle analysis, is this something that has some political ramifications or ethical ramifications or societal ramifications, technology, legal, environmental, these are things that could be problems for the organization, or are these problems transformational to the organization? Are we looking for this to be, for this use case to be something that is designed to be provide competitive parity. So, you're just using it to help you write emails or, help you to summarize reports? Or is this something that we're really going to use for like process optimization or decision augmentation or automation? Or are we really going to be transformative in the organization? So if you're trying to, transition from like a retail to a commercial entity, what does that actually look like? So that the value has to be, what is this going to provide for the organization based on the strategic goals and objectives versus, what are the feasibility costs, or what are the risks, of the feasibility, and sometimes, what I found is that, it's okay to not have a positive dollar return, like back when big data was the big thing, you can spend $20 million on a big data exercise and not really get, $1 in return. It's like, well, what are we going to use this for? It's like, well, I don't know. But it turns out that when there's experimentation, you're ahead of the game, because when the technology changes, you have done all of the, the upfront work to position yourself to take advantage of that. And that's where, vision comes into play. And the hardest part of this whole exercise, I think, is getting executives to talk about, what their vision is for the future of the organization. Because for a lot of different reasons, they feel like, they're going to be, one, it's a waste of time to talk about, strategic goals and objectives. Some truly do believe that, especially if they're operational leaders, keeping the lights on, or, they don't want to stick their neck out and, and potentially be wrong, which is, a huge thing. I mean, that's a real hit to the ego. So it all depends on the kind of conversations that you have with executives and trying to tease that out of them. It's like, would you, it's almost like going to the, getting an eye exam, and they start to flick the machine and say, is it number one or number two? It's like you start going through all those kinds of questions, and that way you get to, what actually are the strategic objectives.
Sure.
And, what is the actual value of that to the organization and its customers and its employees. So this can be interesting conversations.
Absolutely. And then there's the setting of expectations every step of the way, maintaining a pulse on those optics.
Absolutely.
is essential. And you get a sense of how they're wired and what is their
Hmm.
relationship with money? What is
Yeah.
their relationship with risk? What
Right.
is are they the innovators, right?
Right.
Is the culture centered around innovation,
Hmm.
right? Or do we
Hmm.
just have like a few innovative executives that are stuck in this culture that is not innovative,
Right.
right? And how it's an obstacle course, and each
Yeah.
individual is different, and each organization is different, and you have to
Yeah.
get a pulse on that,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah, when I come into an organization to, and that's one of the things that I do offer. I offer like a free 4 hour consultation to just get an understanding, of the organization and see where you really need help. And in that free 4 hour consultation, and this is not a secret. This is something that's used by a lot of people. I do what's called a 3C analysis, where I look at, culture, change management capacity, collaborative capacity. And these things are, indicators of the big rocks in your organization to, actually be able to move forward. When you're looking at culture, exactly as you described, are they innovative? Do they make decisions top down? From the top and execute down? Do they have a longstanding culture of experimentation and saying, hey, this didn't work out, but we're going to document it and shelve it because it may be valuable at some point in the future. And also if you're not, and this is one of the problems with larger institutions, larger organizations. Sometimes they have to fight their own inertia. What is the friction that's available in the organization that halts innovation and halts people from coming up with new ideas and how to do things.
Sure.
That's a
You're like
huge one.
you're a doctor and you're diagnosing,
Yes.
right? So you can have great vision without
Hmm.
execution,
Hmm.
right? An idea without follow through is merely a daydream, right?
Absolutely. Absolutely.
So if the culture is riddled with fear and everybody's afraid to take action
Hmm.
against that vision,
Yep.
right? Then you have to look at the sort of what the model dictates behavior
Hmm.
and mood, and are
Hmm.
there incentives in place?
Yeah.
Are they managing to an appropriate level
Hmm.
fear and greed?
Yeah.
Maybe there's too much fear.
Yeah.
And that impacts, and that culture that's hard to change, right? So you
Yeah.
have a really innovative leader who's got a lot of great ideas, and their ideas maybe 80% are centered around optimization
Hmm.
use cases, but they have that 20%, which is true differentiation for the business.
Right.
Going like
Right.
adding a commercial lending practice to a consumer lending type of
Hmm.
business model, right?
Absolutely.
That is transformational.
Yes.
That's going to move
Absolutely.
the needle.
Yep.
But getting the people to actually follow through on that
Right.
does require governance and guardrails and structure, right?
Absolutely.
So that the people can
Absolutely.
feel comfortable in their execution against that vision.
Yep.
And this is
Yeah.
where the speed to value comes into place,
Absolutely.
right?
Yeah. Yeah. And those are very difficult adoption risks to get over without having, a good change management program in place. And that's one of the things that I really look at, in terms of change management capacity. I look, do you have a really good, like ProSci, certified, change management group. It doesn't have to be a whole department. Do you have someone who has a group of people who really understands things like transformational change, or it doesn't even really have to be transformational change. It could be process optimization or process automation using, I hate to put automation and agentic AI in the same category because they're not, but when you're going to, certain steps within a process with an agent, there are huge adoption risks. There's a lot of friction that's involved in something like that. And if you don't have a good change management structure or function within your organization, it makes it a lot harder. Yeah, that's part of that free 4 hour diagnostic. I'll ask questions about your change management program. I'll ask about, it's like not just, simple, well, how well do you guys collaborate with each other? Oh, what kind of response are you going to get? You
Right.
have to be much more probative, in your questions.
Mm.
And quite often, they'll say, oh, it's great. We got SharePoint. Yeah, it's not necessarily an indicator of collaboration. I'm talking about, people actually working together, not just the tools that they use for that exchange. And that's why it's important to deploy a COE model, because you're bringing in stakeholders from the business. You're bringing in, your project management team. You're bringing in your technology, legal, risk, compliance, ethical officer, which I was also the data ethics officer. You're bringing in all of these different people who can do this analysis, from their own perspective, and you can really truly understand what the feasibility and adoption risks are, um, from multiple different angles. And it doesn't have to be a lengthy exchange. I mean, it can be, very simple and straightforward. It's like if you're trying to, do things, and I hate to use, banking as another example, but if you're trying to do things like, determine, alternative indicators of creditworthiness, as opposed to looking at Fair Isaac scores. There are a lot of things that you can look at. You can look at, you know, um, social media indicators. You can look at, um, you can do, a lookup on, I can't remember the name of the tool. It gives a good, background check on people, and it's like you can get an understanding of the decisions that they make. Do they make good decisions? Do they make, um, sometimes questionable decisions under questionable circumstances? It's like you can get an understanding. It's like there's, a whole sizable demographic that does not have access to the traditional indicators of creditworthiness. It's just not a part of their world. So how do you reach out to that demographic with sound products and services? And it's not just lending. I mean, it's also insurance. It's like, sound underwriting for coverage, right? So it's things that you can do in multiple industries, but it takes people from multiple different perspectives to really truly understand what the feasibility is. What the feasibility risks are of any of those AI use cases, and then what are the adoption risks within the organization. And then you can build a really good business case underneath that, a solid business case, because you understand your costs, you understand the risks associated with it, and what the potential costs are. And if it turns out it's not going to be, something that's going to return a good dollar value on it, or sometimes may cost a little bit more, that's an executive decision. If you say, well, okay, it's really not the best use case from a dollar standpoint, but does it, and this is the thing that I add on to the analysis, does it position the organization well? And if you're positioning the organization to take advantage of opportunities that you didn't have before, that is great. That is awesome.
Mm,
It may be a transformational opportunity, but is your organization ready for that? Right? Or on the other hand, does it position your organization poorly today, but is it the same thing tomorrow?
sure.
Do you see conditions change? So there's a whole matrix that you have to go through to understanding positioning.
Absolutely. So imagine the data that is consumed by
Hmm.
AI agents
Hmm.
to support a certain function, and the output of those agents is additional data,
Hmm.
and it's that additional data that's combined with
Right.
with the inputs that create that value,
Right.
or a launch pad, or a foundation for
Hmm.
that truly transformative value. You have to have the vision. Now, the one big challenge in our culture in the
Hmm.
United States is the executive leaders are trained to stay high level,
Yeah.
and it's frowned upon if they get deep in the weeds,
Hmm.
right? But then you look at somebody like Elon Musk, who can zoom in and zoom out to any level of abstraction to address the problem of the week.
Hmm.
And if he has to roll up his sleeves in the manufacturing plant, he's going to do it. If he has to
Hmm.
help somebody write some code, he's going to do that too. So the ability to
Yeah.
zoom in and zoom out to an appropriate level of abstraction to understand how data is generated as a consequence
Hmm.
of doing business,
Hmm.
right?
Yep.
And
Right.
how that data can be leveraged, managed, governed to
Yep.
support differentiating data products and the associated AI products, right?
Yeah, and, it's amazing. I think that there's also a little bit of a generational difference to leadership, and I think that's really reflected in the tone and the culture, change management, and collaborative capacity of different organizations. So if you're looking at one that is very traditional, run by somebody who is either someone from a boomer or early Gen X, you may be looking at a very different culture organization than you would from somebody who's a little bit younger and maybe capable of moving to multiple layers or levels of abstraction. As you had mentioned, you're right. Traditional executives don't do that, and sometimes it's to their detriment. When you have a executive who is making demands that you do things with data that are potentially it's not potentially. I mean, there's a very high probability of damaging the data to the point where your organization can no longer function, but does not understand that outcome. It becomes a very different dynamic within the organization. For example, I mentioned Cecil earlier. If you have a part of your team who's doing Bank Secrecy Act, anti-money laundering analysis, and they're sending it to a tool like Verifin or Actimize or something like that, and it comes back with errors. Well, why are the errors there? The product is the output of multiple different steps that have gathered all of that data specifically to send that CSV file to some third party for analysis. Well, that's great, but the model that the data was built, the model was built to structure the data for a specific output, for a specific, data product, and it's being used for a product that it's not supposed to be used for. Now, if you change that data set, if you change that data model, well, guess what? You break your Cecil analysis and your CFO is not going to be happy, right? So it's the same thing in the insurance industry. Even though it's a state chartered regulatory structure, there's still a regulatory reporting. You have to understand your actuarial output, right? So there's a lot that could break that. If you have an executive who's demanding that you fix that data, then that becomes a problem. They don't really necessarily understand that is a raw product in and of itself that goes into building other things. So we have executives who are so high level that they don't necessarily understand that doing certain things can break the entire organization, unfortunately. But that is a management style, that is an executive style that you have to be aware of when you're consulting with clients. It's like where's your friction really going to come from in execution? Sometimes it's not just employees. Actually it's not always those who are individual contributors that are the problem for adoption. It's your executive team that could be a problem for adoption because they don't necessarily understand the moving parts and they don't want to. It's like, make it work. It's like,
Right.
okay, well,
Yeah. Don't tell me how the sausage is made. Just give me
give me
sausage.
sausage. Yeah,
That's it,
exactly.
right? Yeah. 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 And it's so it that default to it being a people problem is also a chronic problem in our culture, right? It could be people process or technology, which is like the three-legged stool, but it's not even that. That's still a course model, right? There's a lot of contributing factors. There's the little rungs that attach to the legs to provide stability to the
Absolutely.
stool that you have to have in place
Right.
in order for it to serve its function, which is a seating surface to sit on, right? And maybe that part that you sit on is the vision,
Right.
right?
Good way
But
to
you
put
have
it.
to understand how that three-legged stool actually, from a statics and dynamics perspective, how it actually performs its function.
Absolutely.
And
Yep.
otherwise, you sit on it and there's no stability, and it just collapses. Is there anything else like with regard to PaperKite that you would use as a commercial,
Yeah. So
right?
here's my message for clients and potential clients. So one of the reasons why I focus on both information and AI governance, and one of the reasons why I focus on regulated organizations, is that you can have two conversations and they're both good conversations to have. right? So there's speed to value, and there's also guardrails. And I think what often gets missed in the conversation is that those guardrails provide speed to value, right? So if you're trying to win a race, and you don't win a race by just running somewhere, anywhere, right? You run a race by going from start to finish, and by the way, there's a track there, some sort of course, right? And there are all sorts of guardrails along that course. There are rules about staying within the course. There are rules about behavior when you're in the course. There are things that you should do, things that you shouldn't do, things that you can't do in order to be, a qualified winner at the end. Those guardrails actually provide speed to value. When you're having those conversations going through your use cases and you're trying to determine the right use case and how it aligns with your strategic goals and objectives, and all of the guardrails that are put into building your business case, understanding the adoption risks, the feasibility risks within your PESTLE analysis, and all the guardrails that you put into the development, the execution, the actual use of those AI products, the maintenance of those AI products, the eventual disposition of them once they no longer serve the organization's purpose. The more guardrails and controls you put into that process, the faster you're going to actually achieve value with that AI use case and that AI product, or that instantiation of a use case being the AI product. The faster you're going to do that, or the guardrails that you put in place equals speed to value. Too many organizations right now are in the experimental phase, and that's fine. It's fine to be experimental with something, especially that's new and you're really not sure how it's going to position your organization. That's absolutely acceptable to be in a experimental phase, but you can't have it go on forever. You have to start putting some rigor into the process and getting something out of it that meets some set of expectations. Like I said, it doesn't have to be a dollar expectation. It could be how it's going to position your organization in the future based on your strategic goals and objectives. But you have to have that conversation, and you have to move forward, and you have to put rigor around it to get that speed to value.
Execution with wisdom. So the difference between a smart person and a dumb person.
Yeah. Well, yeah, that's one way to put it.
Oh, the smart man and the wise man, let's put it that way.
Yeah.
So the smart person learns from their own mistakes,
Yep.
and the wise person learns from the mistakes of others. And that's really what
Absolutely.
governance is about. It's about establishing those guardrails
Yep.
that provide a vehicle for continuous iterative experimentation.
Yes. Yes, absolutely. And I come pre-equipped. I absolutely believe in the adage, never come to a party without at least a bottle of wine. It could be a $3 chuck, it doesn't matter, what it is that you're actually bringing to the party, as long as you're bringing something you can build off of. So if I bring in, policies, standards, controls, and these are things that are not necessarily implemented, by hand. And I recommend that you don't. However, you have to understand what those policies, standards, controls are in order to start having the conversation. How do we automate these? How do we bring in the right toolkit for our organization? How do we invest? It doesn't matter what tool you invest in. There's always going to be some problem with fit or finish, but making the best decision you can based on what's available today and how it's going to grow in the future. So I bring those tools with me so that you can understand how you need to move as an organization and how you need to grow and mature.
Right? To actually stimulate innovation.
Right.
Right?
Absolutely.
And execute with wisdom.
Yes, absolutely.
Absolutely. Yep.
Awesome.
Cool.